Good afternoon. This is the Devar Torah on Parshas Miketz. This Parsha, most years, coincides with Hanukkah, which we're in the midst of now. I'll shortly explain what's the connections. In any event, what is Miketz? It's the end of 2 years. Yosef has been locked up in prison an extra 2 years after interpreting the dreams of the wine servant and the butcher of Pharaoh. Now, why did he have to serve it 2 years? Instead of trusting that Hashem would get him out of there, he asked the wine server to do that. And of course, he forgot and he deliberately didn't want to. If one looks at the wording of the end of last week's parsha. And even when Pharaoh has his dream, begins with Pharaoh's dream, where he sees 7 healthy cattle. He's standing on the river, by the river banks, sees 7 healthy cattle. And then he sees 7 starved out ones. They consume the 7 healthy cattle, and they disappear. It doesn't look like they swallowed anything. They're just as gaunt as they were. Then there's a head of corn, wheat with 7 ears. It gets consumed again. 7 emaciated ones come up, and they also get swallowed. They swallow up the healthy ones. And then Pharaoh wakes up from the second dream. All of his astrologers who were trying to find meaning in things through impure sources, none of them succeed in explaining it. Then the wine servant, in discussing him in the most negative way possible, says to him that this is Hebrew slave who can interpret dreams. In other words, he puts him down that he's young, he's a Hebrew slave, and he's a prisoner. Pharaoh calls for him. Yosef interprets the dreams, and in the satisfying ways that satisfies Pharaoh. And then he says if Yosef suggests somebody of wisdom should take care of, save the abundance of the first 7 years. And then when the hard years of no harvest, the starvation show, Egypt will be prepared. Pharaoh decides with his approval of his officials to make him into the viceroy, second only to Pharaoh. And he then assembles and does everything, brilliantly organizes everything. When the fast hits, Yaakov asks his sons to go down and buy some grain so they'll have something to eat. And what happens then? They go down. Yosef doesn't recognize them, but they don't recognize him. After all, it had been 13 years, actually longer, when he meets them. And he accuses of being spies. And he says, the only way I'm going to believe you is if Benjamin, the younger brother, is sent down. Yaakov eventually reluctantly agrees. They come down, and Yosef goes through this whole complicated scheme where it turns out that his wine cup, which was also a method of divination, shows up in Benjamin's bag sack where it had been put, and it ends on that note. Now, I would like to go into this whole thing of what does it mean, Kates? It means the end. The end of what? Now, before I do that, I would like to point out that Hanukkah and Parshas Miketz in most years, last 2 years were exceptions, but in most years come out together. And what is the connection? On a Parshat level, basic level, it explains that in the count at the end of the Parsha, normally all they count, this is brought down by Arizal and others, normally what they count tells you how many verses, pesukim, there are. This Parsha, uniquely, of all the Parshas, 54 Parshas in the Torah, this one also tells you the number of words. Now, what were the number of words? as explained by the Arizal, B'nai Yisachar, and many others. What's going on is they look at the gematrias. Gematria, each Hebrew letter also has a numerical value. Now, if you look at the word ner, which is a nun resh, that is 50 plus 200 is 250. You multiply that by 8, the number of the nerot we light in Hanukkah, you get 2,000 plus the extra 25. That represents the month of Kislev, the date in which the Hanukkah miracle starts its celebration, 25th of Kislev. So we have it on that level, but it goes much deeper. Now, one common theme here is what do you have in both cases? Darkness going to light. In the case of Yosef, he was a prisoner. He was caught by the evil plotting of Potiphar's wife, the Egyptian baker wine merchant who ignored him. And so what's coming out? He's finally getting out from the klipot, the forces of impurity, to the place of light where he becomes the master of Mitzrayim, Egypt. And so too with Hanukkah, where you see there's the depths of darkness. The Greeks represented darkness, all kinds of depravity, because even though we're familiar with a lot of the Greek concepts like democracy and the Greek myths, on the whole, it was an extremely impure society that turned the temple into a place of idol worship. That's one. So we see this parallel. Yosef comes into light, and after tremendous odds, the Maccabees managed to defeat the Greeks. That's one meaning. Another meaning is the forces of impurity are known as klipot. So what happens? In the case of the klipot, which was all the impurity of Egypt, all the darkness, what comes out of that comes the purity of a Yosef. And not only is Yosef elevated, he sustains his values. Even though he's in the most impure place, he represents the sphere of Yesod, foundation, which is the source of light in the Shem system of the higher worlds and the spheros. And he did that even though being in that darkness. We see the same again with the Maccabees. As I said, they triumph. And on another level that the Arizal Neosasar give, connected with these klipot, forces of impurity, from out of that darkness comes the sparks of holiness. We see that in not only with Yosef, but we see that in the Hanukkah story. From that impurity comes the sparks of holiness, of Kedusha. And by looking at the menorah, either the oil or the candles, we are seeing the original light, the orgonuz, the light that was there in the first days of creation. Now, Adam and Chava had that pure light, the orgonuz, the hidden, concealed light, that we, until what happened, they committed the sin of eating from the fruit, and they were ejected from Garden Eden. Now, if you look at that, how many hours did they have that light? 36 hours. How many candles or oil, the cups do we light up? 36. You might ask, well, the sets they have for these candle lighting is 42. It's 44. However, the rest of those Hadashamas, which we light up so that we won't get any benefit of the light, because all we're supposed to be seeing is the concealment, is that hidden light. And another level, let's look at the number 7, which is also here. We see Pharaoh has a dream of 7 cows, good ones, 7 unhealthy ones, 7, the head of corn with 7, and then the 7 not good-looking ones. That represents the world of Teva. That represents the world of nature, where nothing goes higher, everything evolves. That is another thing we see. And Hanukkah represents the opposite. There's 8 lights, 8. Why? That represents the number 8, which is Narala Prague explains, means above nature, above Teva, which is the level we operate on. And this is how we get elevated. And Yosef, again, was in a similar way acting like that and defeating the so-called number 7 of the dream of Pharaoh and elevating things, even in the midst of that, with his 2 sons, Ephraim and Menashe. Now, continuing, we have a couple more significances here. First of all, if you look in the candle lighting, it says, Vihi Miketz Chanukah Yamim. It was at the end of 2 years, literally at the end of 2 years of days. Now, what is that? How is that tied into Hanukkah? As Menei Yissaschar explains, Shmuel Ner Takamas Yamin Mezuzah. The left candle under the right mezuzah, the right side of the menorah, alluding to the laws where to place the Hanukkah lights. Why is that significant? Because the right represents light, represents purity, which represented Yosef and represented Jews in the time of the Hanukkah story, while the left is the forces of impurity and the forces of Tumah. So we see that theme yet again. And question with all this is all very interesting. Yosef's stories happened thousands of years ago. The story of the Hanukkah miracle happened, depending which dating you take, happened at least almost 2,100 years ago. What is the significance that we see it for today? There are some very important themes. As we look around society today, I'm not only talking Israel, I'm talking in the world, it's on the decline educationally in terms of moral purity and impurity. We're not much high above the level of the Egyptians. Yet, even in the midst of that, we still are able to elevate ourselves and can remain above that. And that's what seeing the light of the menorah will do for us. That will carry us through the year. Is to see that organ, see that Malchus of Hashem, see his presence. Another lesson that's taught here is we see that, well, how does Hashem work, God work? He goes through the darkness. He conceals himself in darkness. Everything looks terrible. And yet, then his glory, his light, his salvation of the Jewish people is revealed. We see that with going back to the Persians, for example. We see that even before that, the liberation from Egypt, which will be in Sefer Shmos. But we also see that the light, the positive, they still, in the Greek society and the Egyptian, both were steeped in incredible immorality. The Jews made themselves at a different level. We also see something else. We also see the darkness. When things look the most dark, suddenly Hashem comes in, makes a miracle, not only the Hanukkah story, at the time of the Purim story, looked like all the Jews were going to be destroyed by Haman. Not only did we arise from that, but a few years later, by all of the maneuvering that Hashem did in the story of Megillas Esther, we're allowed to, his son allows us to come, with Esther, allows us to come back to Eretz Israel, something that nobody foresaw. They figured it was over. It wasn't. We see that looking at our age, looking at the more recent times, at the time of the Spanish Inquisition, where everything looked dark, many Jews left on the high seas to try to escape to the east. Yet at the same time, the Jews in 1492 were leaving Spain, heading east. Columbus's 3 ships were heading west and had the discovery of America, which became a place of salvation for the Jewish people. That's starting to come under question now, but until recently, anyway, that was the case. And we see other miracles. If you looked at the battles of the Greeks versus the Jew, the first battle was 80 Kohanim, who were not exactly what you would call athletes, or great shape, or commandos, against a 100,000-man army. And it was only through open miracles of Hashem, through his angels that represent the 70 nations, they were destroyed. And looking to our end, looking at the darkest of darkest days, the show of the Holocaust, nobody predicted that 3 years later, the Jews, there'd be an ingathering of the Jews, and Israel would be established as an independent country for the first time in 2,000, almost 2,000 years. And we saw that even more recent events now, when things were most dark after the October 7th, a little over 2 years ago. Yet from that came our salvation. And we triumphed, even though there's still problems, triumphed over our 7 enemies. And so from this, we should see that even though things are in flux, and even though we see tragic things like the massacre recently, it's like part of a greater plan, just like Yosef going down to Egypt and Hanukkah, it's all part of a greater plan. And if we just keep belief and truly look at this, and we can get this all from Hanukkah, hopefully that will help bring the ultimate redemption. Good Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom, and Hanukkah Sameach.